Welcome to Sikhcast, brought to you by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.
In this episode of the Sikhcast, we share a timely conversation hosted by Jasleen Kaur, featuring Harinder Singh and Santbir Singh. Together, they explore the meaning of the Kirpan, Panthic accountability, and the cultivation of inner grace, reflecting on how Gurmat guides Sikh individuals and institutions in responding to the moments of crisis with wisdom, responsibility, and compassion.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you for joining us for another Current Events podcast. I'm joined today by Harinder Singh, who's a senior fellow at the Sikh Research Institute, and Santbir Singh, who's a research associate here at Sikh. So today we're going to talk about the Vickrum Digwa case in the UK. But we're also going to take that conversation and expand it into the larger implications that this case is reminding us of, the larger reflections that we ought to be having as a community and as individuals. So for those who don't know, for some context, Vickrum Digwa was convicted of murder in the UK early in June, late in May, in what became a nationally talked about case and then globally talked about. I'm just going to give a little bit of detail on the case to try and help us understand why it's reverberated so widely across the UK and broader Sikh diaspora and even Sikhs in India. But in this case, on December 3rd, 2025, then 22-year-old Digwa stabbed 18-year-old Henry Nowak 4 times with a 21-centimeter long knife, first in the chest, then in the legs, groin, and face. Nowak was alone and unarmed. And the important thing here, which came out in the court proceedings in the transcript, is that Digwa is an Amritdhari Sikh, described by the judge as a member of the Order of the Nihangs, and was carrying a Kirpan under his clothes in addition to the beshkubs he used to stab Nowak. I'm not going to get into the details of the case. They're harrowing. I think what's important to know is that Digwa did deny the murder, claimed self-defense, and there were sort of multiple lies that were told over the course of the night that are all documented in the judge's statement. What's important here is that Digwa's actions have put the whole Sikh community in the UK and in the globe in danger. The judge pointed this out. There's been more cases of racial tension and hate crimes happening in the UK where I am now. And so I think for all three of us today, we'd like to push ourselves to think more widely about what this could mean. We have a board member from the UK who said that as a British Sikh, the atmosphere has been somewhat hostile to him personally and in his small community. And I've definitely seen just general trepidation and fear around going out, being alone among Sikhs, especially elderly Sikhs or vulnerable Sikhs in the UK. So, since the sentencing, I think there's a few things that we felt have been missing from the conversation. So we'd like to cover today how we understand the Kirpan, how we understand accountability. So what is our responsibility to one another in our smaller Sangats and sort of as a Panth at large? And how does this case connect to right-wing geopolitical realities? Because we have seen right-wing figures like Elon Musk and J.D. Vance tweeting about this case to foment white supremacist ideas of, replacement in the West. So I know all of that is a lot, but hopefully now we're all kind of caught up. Harinder Singh, I'd like to start with you. Can we just start with this first big question of trying our best to understand the principles behind the Kirpan? So if you could spend some time on that, that would be a helpful framing.
Sure. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. When we invoke anything in Sikhi, we got to start with Bani, because there is no disagreement on what is in Guru Granth Sahib. And when we look at how Guru Nanak Sahib is presented in Guru Granth Sahib, it says Guru Nanak started a Raj. Nanak Raj chalaya sach fort satani neev hai. He started a particular way of rule or governance. And in that very stanza, the word khadag is used. So we start there. He says, Mat Gur Satya Balwant Zwar is written in Ramkali Rag. And in that line, he says, Mat Gur Atam Devdi. Khadag Jor Parokai Jiyade. What it's saying is that the generally what we end up calling ki sada Gyan Khadag is a more Punjabi phrase we use to describe this line, that it was actually sword was passed over. Sword of words, sharpened intellect, sharpened thinking. So thinking, wisdom is directly correlated with sword in Guru Granth Sahib. Are they two different things? Absolutely. Physically, they're two different things. One is internal, one is external. But externalization is what is internal. This is what Guru Nanak had. This is what Guru Nanak gave to Guru Angad. So that's the first point. Second point I want to make is I have heard this even in last 2 weeks. The word Kirpan is not in Guru Granth Sahib. How can we say this? Well, it is in Guru Granth Sahib. We just don't present it rightly. Kirpan, the word literally comes twice in Guru Granth Sahib. And there it only means grace. Kirpan, the word Kirpan literally means grace. The way Gurbani uses this word is in the sense of grace. In Sikh nation building, what we sometimes say community development, or in the words of Guru Granth Sahib, when the Ummat was developed, Ummat is the nation. The development and the responsibility when it is coming together, when Dasve Padsha, the 10th Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj on Baisakhi Day used the word Kirpan even for what the world at the time called by multiple different names, which in English we call sword. So Kirpan actually just means grace. When we are explaining it today, because how it was used 1699 on the world, specifically by the Sikhs, before that Gurus also used it, Sikhs also used it, but now we have institutionalized that this is a graceful act. So now we evolve it to say something which is used gracefully to protect somebody's honor or honor. But in Guru Granth Sahib, it just means grace. Third thing I will say is that even within Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj's period, there are many words, because every word, as you know, or the connotation on the, as we say, there is a secondary text which uses multiple words. As Kirpan, Khando, Khadag, Tupuk, Tabar, Artir, Saif, Sarohi, Sathi, Yeh Hamare Peer. Peer otherwise is someone in the Islamic Sufi tradition who magically does things. And in the secondary text of the Sikhs, they're saying when we import these weapons, including the one which is mentioned as Kirpans, they are actually the one which produce magic in this world. So ਇਹਦਾ usage ਹੈ ਸਾਡਾ ਕਿ ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ weapon ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗੇ. And this thing about is it an offensive or defensive way, this is coming from our complexes. Guru doesn't put any adjective in front. We know it is about the rule. It is about grace. It is about these are your spiritual allies. And if I can just finish this comment, third element of this I would say is when Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj does use it, and which Sikhs like to really mention this line many a time out of context, but many a time in context. Ki chukar az hame hilte darguzasht halal ast burdan bashamshir dast. This phrase in Farsi from Zafarnama, ithe word jada aaya na hega halal. Halal literally is what is permissible. And the larger context of that, if you read 20th share, 21st share, and the 22nd, which is the line I recited, the pura context sirf yahi hai that we have tried many things. We are looking in front, and your soldiers, meaning imperial army soldiers or your adversaries, they're wearing swords and arrows and guns. And now we are going to use this because for us, in their vocabulary, it is being explained. And this is the point I want to make. And our vocabulary is important for us, but when we are facing an adversary in the field, we must use their vocabulary. He says, now this is halal for me to use because you are doing this with many more weapons, and I have used every other strategy and exhausted the means. This forms from conception to how in the field as a just war theory, even if you want to use that Western phrase, how the Kirpan got incorporated over 240 years in the Sikh tradition. This forms our ethos.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I think it sort of dovetails nicely into the next question, which Santbir Singh I'd like to hear from you on, which is, so we have this this long history, this foundation of the Kirpan, and we also know that the Kirpan doesn't exist in isolation. That it's one of the Panch Kakars, that it's a gift from the Guru that we accept with deep devotion and commitment. So I think it would be helpful for all of us if we dwelled a bit on that, if we tried to understand the Panch Kakars as a complete framework. So if you could spend a little bit of time on that and on what taking Amrit is actually meant to mean to the person receiving it. I know that when I was kind of looking into to this, related to this case and also related to other Sikri work, one of the things that I kept seeing was this sense of like restraint and discipline, and also like tenderness in how commitment to accepting the Panch Kakar sort of gets framed. So if you could spend a little bit of time on that, offering us a larger context to the Kirpan, I think that would be really helpful too.
Yeah, for sure. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. So the Kirpan is, of course, one of the Panch Kakar that Sikhs are mandated to wear upon their bodies when they receive Amrit from the Panch Pyare. And the Amrit Sanchar ceremony, or the Khande Ki Poh ceremony, is a really multifaceted one that has a lot of different meanings to a lot of different folks. For some people, it's much more of a spiritual journey. It's about receiving Nam from the Guru. For others, it's more of an initiation into a wider family or community. And for others, it's like a swearing an oath, almost in a military sense, of becoming part of this order of the Khalsa. And I think all three of those things are true and should demonstrate the depth of meaning and incredible incredible resources that Guru Gobind Singh Ji built upon when he created this ceremony and developed it in 1699 and afterwards. Now, the Panch Kakar, as you said so beautifully, they are considered gifts, and that's how most Sikhs understand them, that these are gifts from the Guru. And the obligation of wearing them is not an obligation that comes out of fear or comes out of a sense that if we don't do this, that we'll be punished by the Guru, or that there will be something bad that will happen to us. Or on the other hand, that if we do this, that something good will happen to us, or that we will be rewarded in some way. Instead, it's much more this idea that the Guru has blessed us with these things, and we wear them with pride because they are gifts from our beloved, from the one that we love. You know, Professor Pooran Singh writes about this quite often, about how these are gifts that we receive with such care and devotion, just like a bride receives gifts from her husband, you know, on her wedding day, for example. In the larger context of what we're talking about today, the Kirpan, obviously, out of all the Kakars, really stands out compared to many of the other things that we wear on our person. It's the thing that gets the most attention, especially in the diaspora. It's something that makes a lot of folks uncomfortable because it is a sword. That's what it is, what it comes down to. That's what the Kirpan is. And we sometimes use other words for it, but Sardar Kapoor Singh is very careful in his language. He says we should always use the word sword when translated into English, because a sword has a lot of connotations with it, whereas something like a dagger or something has other connotations with it that aren't as noble or just. And so the Kirpan is this very visible, and I want to be careful here in the word that we use, because of course some people say it's a symbol, but we have to be very careful not to reduce the Kakars to symbols, because if we reduce them to symbols, then they can be interchanged with other things very easily. Then you can say, why not just wear a medallion around your neck? What's the need for wearing a Kirpan on your person, you know? And you can very quickly get into semantics and start to play with these sort of logic games to get through loopholes of how to be an Amritdhari person. Instead, these are articles of faith, I think, is a term that a lot of Sikhs like to use, because they demonstrate that these are things that demonstrate the faith of a Sikh to a wider tradition, to the Khalsa, and that they represent a commitment by the Sikh to something greater than themselves. And that's the part that we really want to talk about here today, which is this idea of responsibility and accountability within the community. You know, when the Panth was very small, when we were living in the jungles in the 1700s, it was very easy to keep a Sikh accountable to the rest of the Panth. If somebody did something that was contrary to Gurmat, they would be called to attention right in front of the Sangat right away, and people would, suffer the consequences of their actions right away. Now in a global Panth with so many different sampradas and jathebandis and different groups all around the world with different levels of adherence and different levels of responsibility and different levels of strictness when it comes to the kakars especially, we have a situation where it's very difficult to imagine that we are accountable to each other and accountable to the Panth as a body as a whole. And that's what we need to get back to. This idea of Panthic accountability. That once someone receives Amrit, that it is a great gift, but it is also a burden in a lot of ways. It's a burden in the sense that it is something that we must live up to. And if we look at what the level of being a Panch Pyara is, what an Amritdhari is, this is something that Guru Gobind Singh Sahib himself bowed down to in 1699. So that's the level that we want to reach. That's the ultimate level we want to reach, that we can be the one who administers the Amrit to the Guru. That would be the ideal, of course. If we want to reach that level, we have to have a sense of responsibility in terms of all of these articles of faith and how we treat them, how we use them, how we wear them upon our person, and how we act within the world. In this case, the person who was wearing the kirpan fell really short of what the principles of the kirpan are. As we all know, that's quite obvious. But there needs to be a larger discussion that needs to be had. How can we be accountable to each other? How can we hold other Sikhs to account? Because if we're not holding other Sikhs to account, then the state will step in. And do we really want the state to start determining what a Sikh is or what a Sikh isn't, what a kirpan is or what a kirpan isn't, or how to wear a kirpan or how it should not be worn? If we don't want the state to be involved in those discussions, then we need to instigate those conversations amongst ourselves and start to have those conversations about what it looks like to be an Amritdhari and what responsibilities that comes with, and how we can behave and how we should behave in a certain way when we have something as noble as a kirpan, which carries with it so much responsibility.
Yeah, thanks. And I think we'll come back to that question of responsibility and accountability. I wanted to actually dwell a little bit on what you said. It was interesting, the Kapoor Singh sort of rough quote that you had of like why I use the terminology of sword. Harinder Singh, I'd like to take this to a question I've been thinking about a lot. Of like what constitutes the kirpan. There is like some debate that I've seen over whether what was used to stab Nowak ought to be classified as a kirpan or if it's something else. At least in the UK, there's been a video recirculating of young boys in some kind of altercation. They're all young Sikh boys, and one of them's holding up a like double-sided serrated hunting knife to the other boy's neck. And sort of, yeah, threatening him. So I'd been thinking a lot about like, what is the kirpan? Which maybe sounds like a silly question, but I know we have written in the past, like in our State of the Panth Meedi Pidi report, about the kirpan originally being a larger blade, and colonial laws bringing that length down to a more like quote unquote acceptable size in the context of those legal systems. But something that the three of us have actually talked about is that like there isn't a Panthic codification about what constitutes a kirpan. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and whether it's ever been tackled by our institutions or like the attempt has been made. Yeah.
Let me try to or attempt to answer that question in connection with where Santbir had taken it.
Sure.
I've actually been part of conversations on this in personal capacities and what I'm doing with myself. In the organizations, I have played either passive or active role in the last 35 years. And panthically, to some extent, with some jathebandis or even at the Sarvat Khalsa format. I can say this is not about conversations anymore. We have had a lot of conversations on these. Actually, we are missing our own governing model. And this is not that we want state to come in or not. State has already come in multiple cases, including in the West, and not just in the cases where individual is at fault, in cases where multiple individuals within Gurdwara are at fault also. So ota ho chukya. So let's admit to that. Why it has happened? Because it's missing that. Now, coming to this question, when we lost our governance, these questions came up. What length? Because somebody has to make it permissible. Guru Gobind Singh made it permissible for us. I just read that Zafarnama line. Now we are seeing, if it's an issue in Canada, we've been fighting, including in Supreme Courts, what is the length? Will it be, sued on top or not, so person cannot take it out if it's in high school, to a conversation on 10 footy, 1 footy, 6 inchi. So these are the words used in Punjabi. Is it going to be 3 feet long, 1 foot long, 6 inch long, and multiple variations of this? Look, we actually don't know what is permissible anymore, because that is largely being based on where we are fighting for our civil or human rights. Okay, that's first point. Permissible is what Guru Gobind Singh said. So it is between you and the one who receives it. We are not defining this length. This has come to us as a question when we want to walk into Indian Parliament. Well, they allow up to 1 foot and 6 inches, some cases even on airlines. But in Parliament, it became a debate when it happened. I remember personally also, Santbir, in mid-90s, when I would be flying from Vancouver to Kansas City, I would have my almost a foot-long kirpan in airplane, and they would allow it to go through securities. I also remember buying different kirpans, some which look like traditional kirpan, some don't. 1999, there's a Swiss Army kirpan. Jot Singh Khalsa is making his own decorative kirpans. Some resemble traditional circular, semicircular look, some don't. But actually, only kirpan banonde. This is what I'm going after. The length doesn't make it a kirpan. The offer of acceptance in grace makes it a kirpan. And then using it as a last stratagem makes it a kirpan. Also, alawa baki sara kuch is debatable. And that debate will continue. So really, yes, even in India, even in SGPC, even in other takats, they have given, for this purposes, inni kar lo. Because, Sikhs have been pragmatic, let's be honest. Since we have been under non-Sikh rule in our 18th century guerrilla warfare to British, annexation of post-Punjab to other states we have been living in, and now the modern sense, we have been pragmatic. We have worked with the state. We don't like to violate the law of the land if they are being reasonable with us. The problem is there is unreasonable in my own behavior. And this is not about Vickrum Singh Digwa. And we should never make this about Vickrum Singh Digwa. No Sikh has supported him. All the few elements exist. They're always supporting something. But largely, community is very clear on this. This really is about Kirpan, except who is accepting the Kirpan? What is their relationship with Kirpan? Is it going back to, if I can, where I started today is when you asked me the first question, in that very stanza, if I loosely translate even that line in English, it is actually all about Naam, which Santbir alluded to. Because in that line is saying Guru Nanak is bestowing the gift of Naam to Pahilana by making him Guru Angad. And to make him Guru Angad from Pahilana, he's doing it through the mighty sword of wisdom and spiritual strength. But for what? So he can be in the remembrance of Naam. Because what does Naam represent for Sikhs? In Guru Granth Sahib, it represents wisdom and light, which essentially is how we take the intangible form of Ek Oankar and make it very pragmatic and personal and living situation with us. So, oh wala part totally missing hega for even me, if I may say this. Okay? So we have to come to some genuine reflections. Where is Naam in the sword? Is Naam even being invoked in the sword in my relationship? And where it is, even Harmanjeet Singh wrote, we are in June 84. Harmanjeet Singh had written a song about this. And in that song, in the preface, he uses this line. It's beautiful. He said कि जेड़ा शस्त्र है ना, वो साध हत्थां विच ही ठीक वर्त हुंदा. Simply put, that shastra is a weapon. Kirpan is not just weapon, we have other weapons also, which we are permissible by Guru Gobind Singh. We don't need any other state's permission. We just need to work on those wherever we are not being allowed. But it only is suitable in the hands of people who are saintly, people who are drenched in the love, the Naam. They don't lie about it. They don't misuse it. Criminal element aside, this is the largely the challenge, if you ask me, in the Panth regarding Naam and Shabad, and wisdom is less and less when we invoke Kirpan. And where it needs to be starting there, then the end will not be where we are in this situation and many other situations.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'd like to I think that brings me into the sort of larger conversation that I wanted to have. And I want to have this conversation very delicately and in a nuanced way. So forgive me if it takes a little while to say what I'm trying to say before I ask the question. Some of the most kind of evident stuff that we've seen happening around the globe is a rise in fascism and nationalism and a kind of like crisis of masculinity because the world as we know it is changing. And I'm relating that to this discussion because one of the things that was pretty remarkable in not a good way was the use of this particular case by far-right groups as justification for that same kind of anti-immigration rhetoric, racism, nationalism, Christian nationalism. So something is happening where these kinds of ideas are gaining traction in every community in just like different hues. And I was thinking a lot about this. I know that this conversation is not particularly about this case, but I've been thinking about it a lot as a symptom of something larger. And I wanted to have a discussion about sort of that crisis of masculinity and how it manifests in our community amongst our young men. And so, Santbir Singh, I'll first ask you to reflect on this. I think I'd also like you to reflect on it, Harinder Singh. But, Santbir, you've written about sort of masculinity and the quote-unquote manosphere, and how that sort of manifests in Sikh communities, especially amongst our young men. And you've also reflected a lot on the Nihang angle to this, because as the judge had said, this particular person was initiated into the Nihang sect, I think the judge called it. So for those unfamiliar, can you give us a picture of who the Nihangs are historically, what they stand for, and how this order has evolved, particularly in the diaspora over the last few decades? And maybe you can connect that with trends that you've noticed amongst young men and this question of a masculinity crisis, with the disclaimer that like this conversation is not an attempt to attack any like jatha or quote unquote sect, but to just talk about what it is that we're observing. Yeah, please go ahead.
And I think this conversation is really important to have because, when there's a school shooting in America, people in America will say, well, nothing could be done about it. This is just the way things are. Those of us from other countries that look at America, we're like, well, it's quite obvious that these are the reasons why these keep happening in America. That there's certain things that are prevalent in American culture that are allowing these incidents to happen again and again. And if we want to make sure that incidents like this don't keep happening in the Sikh community, we need to have an honest conversation about what were the factors that led to this incident. And I think one of those factors definitely is this rise of this quote unquote manosphere culture where men feel that even though, contrary to all logic and outward sensibilities, that they are under attack, that women are trying to disempower them, that trying to emasculate them, and that they need to really, really justify their existence. And this leads to, the rise of these groups within the West especially, but all over the world, of these men who uh, sell influence to young men and sell promises of virility and sell promises of making money and popularity and being able to interact with women on their terms and all these other things that are very toxic and very problematic, as we all know. And this isn't something that's just happened in the West. This is also happening within our communities as well. And I think if we look at the rise and the popularity of certain segments of what people called Nihangs over the last 20, 25 years, we can definitely see some troubling aspects of that. This idea of really emphasizing male culture. Uh, a lot of these young men believe that women shouldn't even be part of the Khalsa, in fact, that it should only be a male-centered institution. That this is a culture that really overemphasizes those warrior aspects of the Sikh tradition that we are all proud of, and that is an integral part of our being. But without that Nam foundation that makes it so beautiful and powerful. The Akali or Nahang tradition is a beautiful one, and it's something that all Sikhs lay a claim to as part of our joint legacy as a community. Great, amazing Sikhs like Akali Fulla Singh, Akali Naina Singh, Akali Hanuman Singh were these great leaders in the 1800s and the late 1700s, were these amazing Gursikhs. And they were individuals who dedicated themselves completely to the Panth. In every aspect of their fiber of their being, they were dedicated to the Khalsa Panth and to the Guru Granth. And that's what Nahangs or Akalis used to be. And Bhai Veer Singh has this beautiful description of what a Akali is. It appears towards the end of his book, Satwant Kaur. And he describes what a true Akali is. And it's really powerful and important to read. And he says, an Akali is someone who, has forgotten about all other attachments, but is not a sannyasi, is not somebody removed from the world like a monk, but is somebody who is very much a part of the world and working to make the world a better place, but at the same time is totally unattached to all material possessions. And that was the ideal of the Akalis. Now, the Nihangs of today contain some of the beautiful parts of that ideal, and they've kept a lot of traditions that are really powerful alive. And that's what makes them very attractive to young men, especially. Nihangs are very physically striking, and it's something that a lot of people want to be a part of. It looks like something cool and powerful. And, there's also these claims within the Nihang ideology that this is original Sikhi, or this is pre-colonial Sikhi, or this is authentic Sikhi, or all these other terms. When we can spend a lot of time sort of discounting a lot of those claims that are made by modern Nihangs, but I don't think that would be appropriate for our conversation right now. But just to say that any group that is overemphasizing this masculine aspect of Sikhi so much so that the beauty and tenderness of the Panth is being lost is going to be problematic. Any institution that young men are feeling like they can join and have as an outlet for all of their toxic aspects of modern masculinity is something that we need to be wary of as a community, and we need to be working on. And what I mean by working on is we need to offer alternatives rooted in Nam, rooted in Sikh history, authentic Sikh history, and rooted in a connection to Guru Granth Sahib Ji that uh, allows these young men to feel a sense of belonging, to feel a sense of place, so that they're not lost and they're not being scooped up by groups that are really growing for the sake of growing and growing for the sake of really emphasizing aspects of the Sikh tradition that aren't always what should be emphasized. And I think one conversation that's come up a lot recently is this overemphasis on Bana over Bani. And we know that Bana is very important, that the exterior appearance of a Sikh is integral to what a Sikh is, what a Khalsa is. But of course, it's nothing without the inner Bani, without the inner connection to Gurbani, to Amritnam, that really powers that forward. And so I think, the legacy of those old Akalis is felt all around us today. It's not just something that modern Nihangs get to claim. It's something that all Sikhs can claim. It's people that, fought against the Indian government where in June 84, they laid claim to that as well. When they were defending Harinder Sahib and Akal Takht Sahib, they laid claim to that legacy. And, the Babbar Akalis of 1920s who fought against the British, they laid claim to that legacy too. So this is a really powerful legacy, and we don't mean to discount it or disrespect it in any way, but an overemphasis on certain aspects of it is very troubling, and I think it had a very direct line to what happened in England recently.
Thanks. Yeah, Harinder Singh, do you have any comments on this phrase that Santbir used towards the end, which I've actually seen a lot in some of the sort of like group chats I'm a part of too, of this like emphasis on Bana over Bani, because I'm also understanding this as like then creating the sort of symptoms of a lack of discipline, grace, restraint, compassion, tenderness, which Santbir also said, and how we deal with conflict more generally. And I also think that like this is not necessary. I don't think it's happening only in those circles. Like I don't even think it's only happening in sort of Nihang adjacent circles. I think that like this is maybe a larger thing that we ought to reflect on as a Panth, more generally. But I'd also like, your impressions.
It is happening in every sphere, including the ones who think they are not practicing that, because that's the larger hegemonic culture, which is not state-driven, it is populism-driven. Look, my opinion are simply going to go back to Gurbani. It is crystal clear, like without any debate in Guru Granth Sahib, that ਜਿਹੜੇ ਭੇਖ ਹੈਗਾ ਨਾ, ਭੇਖ is outward garb. There is no place for it without the behavior. It's 100% clear in Guru Granth Sahib. And if that is not accessible because of language, even at that time it wasn't, Bhai Gurdas ji has given explicit historical incidents at the time of Guru Har Gobind, that there are those who want to look like Guru Har Gobind, because he had started dressing a particular way, but without the behavior, they are not the Sikhs. So these warnings are there for us. We are the people of Bani and Bana. There's no question. But the question is coming up because Bani is missing. Bani is behavior change. Bani is not utterance. Why are we uttering? And let me actually cite, at the time, because Harinder Singh is invoked, in a different novel, he actually has a question which he asks. He's asked a question to a forest officer. So, Harinder Singh entered many novels. In one of the novels, a forest officer asks him, have you ever seen an Akali? And by the way, Akali and Nihang are synonymous. They used to be called Akali Nihangs also. The whole history of 18th century cannot be understood without understanding Akali Nihangs. So this is why no group can claim it. It is Panth's history. We all want to be like Akalis and Nihangs. And in the early 20th century, Harinder Singh's answer to that forest officer, the way he describes is, throughout my life, I have only met one. So we think it's colonialism, but look at even early 20th century, kinna rare ho gaya CEO. So that also explains from a Panthic mechanisms, accountability mechanisms, why we are even in more trouble 100 years later. Because it is so rare. And it does happen though. Just earlier this year, a very known Nihang Jathebandi had died. The whole Panth was praising him. That rarely happens because he was one of a kind. But largely, just like we see in every other organization, or any other school of thought or Jathebandi, most of us are compromised in our Bani behaviors. So Bani, which the both clear, we are feminine beings. If one is not able to embrace this, then they have issues with Guru Granth Sahib. And even in that earlier 20th century, somebody like Harinder Singh, who otherwise, when you saw his behavior as a revolutionary, who is fighting the state in militancy, in militant ways, when he writes about his experiences of Sikhi, it is also feminine. So a Sikh experience is established Sikh experience may be debatable as we have made it. It never used to be debatable because in Guru Granth Sahib, it is feminine experience. All I can say to that is I can see it in my own life. Unless there is an embracing of Bani in the inner self, we will keep presenting or projecting or justifying hyper-masculine androcentric behaviors. There is no place for that, as it is not born out of Nam.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think I also want to kind of get into one of the other things that I observed in the community response that can also point us to a larger conversation. You've both invoked accountability and responsibility a few times, and I too invoked it at the beginning of this conversation. So something that had come out after the court case was made public was that we know now that Digwa had been reported to his local gurdwara, or reported by his local gurdwara to the police. I think 2 years prior to the murder, for I think theft of Gatka equipment, and then there was another case of they called it a road rage incident where his brother was waving around Talwar at someone. And multiple community members who knew them and knew Vickrum specifically pointed to kind of, we could call it violent behavior, brash behavior, concerning behavior. So there is this sort of, this sort of conversation now about the responsibility of community members and also of the police, but that's not really our topic of discussion today. And the reason I bring that up is because something understandable and sort of interesting happened when this case first was made public, which is, a rejection of the reality that the actions of one person who's a member of a minority community is then, used to paint an entire community one way. And the frustration of that, which is like completely understandable and fair, that like the reality we live in is one where this happens time and again. But what was interesting is that like the rejection of that reality by different people in our community meant that like there was like a refusal to have any conversation about what this could be symptomatic of. And I was thinking a lot about, the fact that this particular person had taken Amrit, and so much of my understanding around what that means is about a sense of kind of collectivity. So that I'm feeling a real tension in my own kind of brain and heart about like individuality and collectivity, individual responsibility and collective responsibility. So all this like long setup aside, I'm wondering from a community standpoint, what responsibility do Sikh individuals and institutions have to one another, especially when someone initiated into the Khalsa is showing signs of dangerous behavior? And if I can start with you, Harinder Singh, and then Santbir, if you have any additional things to add, that would be great.
I mean, we already know we are in a space where we don't have accountability mechanism. Given that, I think community has already pretty clearly given a very good response. From people who deal with the governing matters, they gave a pretty good response. From conversations with the Akal Takht as to what they feel about this incident, they have responded. Multiple Sikh organizations, we may not agree with their tactics, we may not even agree with their verbiage, but sentiment-wise, it's pretty clear that nobody is saying, well, with minor exceptions, that what he did was right. But I don't think that's the real issue. The reason I say this is Anyone who commits crime, Sikhs have never said to any state कि उन्हें ना punish करो. Question here is not what Vickrum did and how to deal with it. What Vickrum did, we were earlier alluding to, what is that training? Like you just said it, one takes Amrit, where they take Amrit from, what is being said when the Amrit is being granted. That's the conversation missing. And I remember this even in mid-90s when I wanted to take Amrit. All the questions I asked and how Panch Pyare just kept looking at me because I was taking it by the book. It wasn't just a ceremony for me. I remember when I had to organize Amrit ceremony, that's why it involved some classes. People need to understand what this is. And we cannot develop accountability mechanisms which are relevant to 21st century if we don't apply the 21st century understandings, which are based on original principles. So really, I think it's just too much wishful thinking to create accountability mechanism right now. I had conversations with Akal Takht Jathedar on this issue. I had conversations with media advisor. The earlier conversation, I would say, which some organizations are trying to figure out is, how do you contain this when a alt-right reality? Actually, that's the larger issue. Just like the larger issue is, how do I develop self-governance model in the absence of real Sarvat Khalsa? These two larger questions there. So in the alt-right, well, we have to be prepared. We can't be citing if US State Department is tweeting about it and US Vice President is tweeting about it. I mean, Tesla is amplifying this with the extreme of the extreme right in UK. This is not an accident. This is the first time they're probably brought Sikhs into this whole thing in the last few years. And we need to really understand that reality, which I don't think we are understanding fully. And then prepare to respond to it. This is where Gurbani comes in handy again. Sada ta kisi naal bhi permanent alliance nahi hai. Hum har sang tadha kiya, right? Our alliance is only with the pervasive one. But temporarily for particular project, who do you work with? How do we protect the Sikhs if there's an onslaught? Onslaught is not just in India, it happens everywhere. And now we see in post 9/11, we saw part of it in US also. So that preparation demands work. And that preparation is in our states and countries we live in, work with the existing civil rights organizations to figure out how to counter that. This is where should be a larger, if Sarvat Khalsa can't happen, Sarvat Khalsa is about any crisis, this is a crisis we are not prepared for. The amount of guns as Santbir invoked earlier, if the white Christian nationalism, if they make Sikhs to be the number one enemy, we currently are number 5 or 6 for them, how will we deal with it? This is the question. And guess what? In 18th century, Sarvat Khalsa's work out for that. And what is our defense against this crisis? So we have to project these and understand what is happening globally and apply that sword of wisdom and invoke the Guru's Naam and Shabad culture to prepare to protect our own communities as we also try to do other communities. So to me, it is largely about that. Second, I think we forget the Bani again. I don't. Accountability, I haven't actually talked about much. I'm trying to bring self-accountability mostly. Because you cannot bring accountability in the absence of a system. You can only empower individuals to create self-accountabilities. And because Puran Singh was invoked earlier, so I will invoke him in a different sense. And that did a number on me a few years ago. And he said, Kirpan is not yours, it is his. His, he implied, was Guru Gobind Singh. And I have seen this within myself. When I made Kirpan my own, how I thought about it and how we are using it, which is a symptom which we are discussing. But when the Kirpan is of the Guru, the actions will be very different, whether in Vikram's case or several Gurdwara fights, or how we are dealing with even a crisis scenario at individual level. And let me mention that just this week, a Sikh guy who's attacked, he comes out, he tries to deal with it, and nobody's dealing with it. A Hindu gentleman's put out a whole video on this. And what does he do? Then he takes out his Kirpan, he fights them, he takes care of them. Police also comes, nobody files a complaint. And then the Hindu gentleman whose video I saw earlier today, he's basically saying, ye hai Sikh. उसने गलत भी नहीं यूज करी, जो उसको तंग कर रहे थे उनकी फिर ऐसी तैसी फेर दी, एंड पुलिस वालों ने भी कुछ नहीं कहा. So if you take the kirpan away from a Sikh, which is again a permissibility, we don't allow state to do it, and they did this, by the way. They took kirpans out of the gurdwaras in November 84 in Delhi. So we could not defend ourselves because they know, even a Sikh who's untrained, when he holds the kirpan, which is of Guru Gobind Singh's, something will happen. So ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦੋਨੋਂ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਯਾਦ ਰੱਖਣੀਆਂ ਪੈਣਗੀਆਂ. When we use it in a dignified way, just using today's vocabulary, then the world has no issues with it also. When we get into permissions, in the absence of self-accountability and the larger accountabilities, we can keep debating, is it this, is it that? Neither. We got to work towards bringing our conception of sword. And that sword is not symbol for us. It never has been. It will remain a part of grace.
Yeah, this is something that we need to be very clear about, that any attacks on the Kirpan are really disingenuous by any group right now. You can go into first class on an airplane and get a steak knife, and you're given a steak knife. People bring ice skates onto airplanes. It's not a problem. Ice skates I guarantee you, most ice skates are sharper than most people's Kirpans, The issue is not the Kirpan itself. The issue is this larger conversation where we're being attacked as part of this concerted campaign, especially in England right now, but across the Western world, of anti-migrant, anti-immigrant, anti-anything that's not white rhetoric that's being used. And this has played really perfectly into what the Reform Party in the UK has been trying to do. And they really want to push up their numbers in the next election. And their results were not as strong as they thought they should be in the last municipal elections that happened recently in England, across the UK. And so this was a perfect incident for them to really stoke those fires and really, push it. And then we can see how everything works together, how Musk tweets it, how JD Vance tweets it, how they all work together is really, it's very troubling. But we all know that. We know that that's how they work. That's how they operate.
Yeah, I think this is all really helpful. I just was remembering one thing that I did want to say, sort of backtracking to the conversation we had about Nihangs and responses, that there were a bunch of Nihangs that got together in the UK. Was it a Sarbat Khalsa?
So they held what was essentially their version of a Sarbat Khalsa, just with Nihang Jathas. And I think we should give credit where credit is due. They followed a Gurmata process. They invited members of all the different Nihang Jathas across Europe, and they held a meeting. And in the meeting, they appointed Panch Pyare from within the Sangat. And the Sangat had the chance to raise any misgivings, if they had any, about any of the members of the Panch Pyare. Nobody had any issues with them, from my understanding. And then the Panch Pyare made some decisions and then presented it in front of the Sangat, and then the Sangat got to approve it or argue against it. And so this is very much in keeping with certain Panthic traditions. And I think that's really powerful that they did that. And they came up with some really sensible policies out of that meeting as well, in terms of how to treat Shastra, how to treat our weapons, our Kirpan and other weapons, how we should be displaying them in public, and how we should be behaving with them. And they do invoke also in their decision that this is something that is a lot of responsibility and we need to take very seriously. And so we should give credit that, there are groups within the Nihang ecosphere that are trying to make a responsible response to this, horrific situation.
And to add to it, this is where you cannot expect a proper Sarbat Khalsa or internal mechanism through a Akal Takht or other spaces unless each organization and Jathebandi does it among themselves. This is where it really needs to happen. And just to add to one more thing, Santbir, the tweet which Elon Musk did, he actually didn't amplify even reform. He amplified what is right of reform, which is restore party, Rupert laws. So this is not accidental stuff. And when we talk in Sikh sphere, historically, we are not against any individual. In a personal capacity, if somebody messes things up, we deal with it. We don't pay much attention to it. But if something is being organized, this is organized. And whole sort of, even in our conversation, that's why I'm trying to take it away. We need to make it not about Vickrum, because it is not. This is the organized stuff going around. So we need to figure out much more on when there is amplification in an organized manner, which is right of right. This is really a rallying and othering of the levels we have never seen before. And guess what? People stay quiet because we are all collaborators. Because he just did his IPO and people gain 20% in stock one day. So we stay quiet because we become rich with it, right? Those who participate in it. This is the game. This is what Guru Nanak Sahib warned us on. This is what Miri Piri separately when practiced does. So we need to be much more concerned about today's kings, today's upat, the landlords, today's control mechanisms are happening through these things, even if they don't hold elected offices. But which elected offices they would like to occupy, this is very much getting played in front of us globally, including in the West. So if I can, I would like to say this is an opportunity where this is largely not about what happens with the right-wing politics in India, although there are correlations. This is largely about the West, the US, Canada, and UK. Sikhs and Sikh organizations, at least one or two, need to seriously think about how to deal with this rise of the alt-right and its amplification by the trillionaires of the world.
Yeah, I think it's reminding me also of a more recent current event, which is that in Belfast last week, I believe, there were organized quote unquote riots where people had addresses of minority houses and they were literally burning people out of their houses. I think, rightfully, some activists in Belfast have referred to it as a pogrom. So this is, I think this is I know that this is a real thing that sort of lies ahead of us in some way. And I think, I've been thinking a lot about the ways that we align ourselves, thinking that it will keep us safe. So I think it's a helpful zooming out to remember that these games have always been played, and whether or not we kind of keep our head on straight is the question. Maybe we can end it with sort of return to the framing of the conversation and some last thoughts. We have sort of dwelled on this, like whether we understand the Kirpan, what are the foundations of the Kirpan, and the Panch Kakars more largely, and Amrit more largely. What is our relationship to Bani is a big sort of reflective question that I'm asking myself. How do we understand accountabilities, self-accountabilities, and how that might lead to, organized Panthic accountabilities? And then this like connection to right-wing geopolitical realities. And so I can kind of feel in the back of my brain this question repeating itself of like, what is to be done? And so maybe I can ask you both to give us some last reflections on, yes, this is not about this case. What are we sort of being asked to reflect on individually and collectively? Or maybe another way to say that is, what do you hope we take from this? Or what are you personally taking from it? And what are some like things that we can do once we have reflected deeply, and yeah, in a nuanced way. So Santbir, if you could start, and then Harinder Singh, if you could end us off, that would be great.
Yeah, for sure. I thought about what you asked earlier when you said, the difference between individual responsibility and collective responsibility. And I was thinking about the Sikh Ret Maryada and the fact that it has both a inner part to it, your inner life, and then it has a Panthic life or Panthic responsibilities. And I think both of those things need to be emphasized. That when you are part of a Panth, you do have responsibilities, you do have accountability that you need to have. We might not think it's fair that the whole community is being judged by the actions of one man, but at the same time, we do believe that every Sikh is Savalak, and we believe that every Sikh is a representative of the Khalsa Panth. And so, if one of us does do something contrary to Gurmat, that is something that all of us need to reflect on and work on in terms of how can we change ourselves and how can we help uplift the whole entire Panth as a collective whole. Because when you take that promise in front of the Guru, when you make that promise in front of the Panch Pyare and in front of Guru Granth Sahib Ji, you're stepping into a bigger world. And they are very clear, the Panch Pyare are very clear. They tell you, you are now born in Anandpur, your father is now Guru Gobind Singh Sahib Ji, and your mother is Mata Sahib Kaur, and all other Sikhs are your brothers and sisters. And it's very powerful in that moment, but we sometimes forget those ideals. And just like we need to be responsible for our family members, we need to be responsible for our Panth as well, as a community. And that means starting at an individual level, but then working our way, bringing Gurmat values into our organizations and into our interactions with fellow Sikhs, especially when they practice Sikhi different than we might like or appreciate, to bring that mutual respect back into the community.
Harinder Singh?
I don't know if I can offer anything to anyone, to be honest, because what I'm realizing is we have different understandings and different end games in mind. So I'll just invoke Bani, but the line I actually chose to mention in the beginning. And there it says, Nanak Raj Chalaya, Sachkot Satani Neev De. Simply put, Guru Nanak started a rule, a Raj, a dominion. To do what? To give Naam. To who and how? By building a fort of truth, by laying a strong foundation, and the foundation is love of devotion. So those who are interested, if I am interested in furthering this Raj of Guru Nanak, then what do I do? Well, to me, what do I do is what he did with Tupai Lena. And that was the line I focused on earlier, which was Mat Gur Atam Dev. Mat is understanding, intellect. Gur Atam Devdi. Whatever we classify as being the divine element of that, that's what needs to be given. How? Khadak, that's the sword to equip yourself with. Jor, the strength and the power comes from there. Parokai jiya de. Parokai ਵੀ ਉਹੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਗੱਲ, ਜਿਵੇਂ ਜੋਰ ਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ ਪਾਵਰ ਤੇ ਸਟਰੈਂਥ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ, ਤੇ ਜੋਰ ਵੀ ਉਹੀ ਆ, ਪਾਵਰ ਤੇ ਸਟਰੈਂਥ ਤੇ ਪਰੋਕਾਏ ਵੀ ਉਹ ਹੈ, ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਰਜ ਪੈਦਾ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਉਹਦੇ ਚੋਂ, ਹੈ ਨਾ. So I am, part of me is not courageous enough to do something about it because I may not be the full believer in Guru Nanak's Raj. The ones who want to further the Raj of Guru Nanak, and if I want to do that, I got to strengthen through Naam, through wisdom, And the strength, that strength gives the courage and the power which comes out in a sword. And this is the relationship with the one. So this is it. This is the work. There are no shortcuts. None of the gurus did any shortcuts because there are no shortcuts in inner development. And externalization is at that moment what you do. You don't do by calculation what will people like or not. You do because what you are. So that is mat gunartam devi. The divine virtues which Guru is imbibing, is gracing, that sharpened intellect with the sword in your hand produces the courage and power. That's the work.
Thank you both so much for this conversation and for all the care with which you have come to it. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for listening to another Current Events podcast. Hopefully we can all leave this with some more things to reflect on. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
You were listening to Sikhcast by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.